She came up the wagon road on foot with a carpet bag in one hand and the collar of her coat held closed at the throat with the other. The snow had started an hour before at the fork and had not been snow so much as a suggestion of it. Now it was the thing itself, coming down in earnest, the flakes big and slow, and settling into her hair and her shoulders and the road ahead. She had been walking for the better part of the afternoon. Her name was Ellen Grace. She was 28 years old and she had left the boarding house in Cheyenne with what she could carry, and a name on a piece of paper folded into her glove. The name belonged to a cousin she had never met and had not seen since the letters had started 2 years before. The cousin was somewhere past the ridge line, in a valley she had been told she would recognize by a red barn and a bend in the creek. The letters had stopped in October. She had come anyway, because staying had stopped being an option, and coming was the only direction that felt like a direction. She had misjudged the distance the way people misjudge things they have only seen on paper. The wind came off the ridge and took the last of the light with it. The road climbed and then it did not climb, and she could not tell if she was still on it or beside it, and the trees on either side had begun to look the same as one another in the way trees do when a person is stopping being able to see straight. She stopped once to shift the bag from one hand to the other, and did not sit down because she knew if she sat down, she would not stand up. The ranch house showed itself at the bottom of a shallow bowl of land, low and long and lit by a single window on the near side. She saw the smoke before she saw the roof. She turned toward it because there was nothing else to turn toward. The dog came out first, not barking, only watching, the way of a working dog that has decided a person is not a threat, but is also not yet a matter of interest. Behind the dog came a man in a heavy coat and no hat, stepping out of the barn with a length of rope over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her. He did not call out. He walked the length of the yard toward her at a steady pace, unhurried, the snow settling on his shoulders and his dark hair. Caleb Reeve was 34 years old. He had come to the valley 11 years before with his brother and had stayed on alone after his brother had gone east. He was tall and lean in the way of men who work outside in cold country, and he had the quiet of a man who lived a great deal of his life without needing to say much of it. He stopped at a respectful distance from her and looked at her without any expression she could name. "You lost," he said. "I'm looking for the Halloway place." She kept her chin level. The bag was heavier than it had been an hour ago. "I was told it was in this valley." He looked at the road behind her, then at the sky, then at her face. He seemed to be doing arithmetic she was not privy to. "The Halloway place burned last spring," he said. "There's nobody there now." She did not let her face do anything. She had practiced this. Her cousin had been in the letters and now the letters were explained and she would be alone with that later when there was time to be alone with anything. The snow kept coming. Her hand around the handle of the bag had gone past cold and into something else that was not cold anymore, which she knew was the worst thing. Caleb watched her. He did not push. After a moment he looked at the sky again and back at her, and he said the thing he did not particularly want to say and did not see any way around saying. "Stay till the storm passes." His voice was even. 3 days at the outside. The barn's warm and the house has a spare room. You can go on from here when the road clears. She looked at him, taking his measure. He did not look away and he did not fill the silence with anything. He was offering shelter and no more than that, and he was leaving her the room to accept it as such. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, took the bag from her without ceremony and turned back toward the house. The dog fell in beside him. She followed, and the snow came down harder behind them, and the light in the single window grew as they came near it and became, for the first time in many hours, a thing she was walking toward instead of past. The house was warmer than she had expected and smaller than it had looked from the yard. A front room with a stove doing steady work in the corner and a table pushed against the near wall, 2 chairs at it, a third leaning by the door. A rifle on a rack above the mantel, oiled and clean. A row of pegs by the door with 2 coats on them and a place for a third. A kettle on the stove that had been on the stove long enough to be part of it. The floor was swept. The lamp on the table was trimmed. It was a house kept by a man who had made his peace with keeping it alone. He set her bag inside the door and did not touch it again. He pointed with his chin toward a doorway off the front room. Spare rooms through there. It's cold. I'll build the fire up in it after supper. He crossed to the stove and put a fresh piece of wood into it and stood a moment with his back to her, adjusting something in the damper. Coffee's on, cups on the shelf. She stood where he had left her, snow melting off her shoulders and into the collar of her coat. Her fingers had begun to hurt, which she knew was the good sign. She took her coat off slowly because her hands would not do the buttons quickly, and she hung it on the empty peg, and she went to the shelf and took down a cup. He watched her without appearing to watch her. He was a man who took the measure of a person by their small movements, and she was aware of being measured, and she did not mind it because his measuring had nothing performative in it. He poured the coffee for her because her hands were still not right, and he set the cup on the table and stepped back from it, and he said nothing about her hands. She sat. She wrapped her fingers around the cup and let the heat come into them slowly. Ellen Grace, she said, because a name was owed and she did not want him to have to ask. Caleb Reeve. That was the whole of the introduction. He went out to see to the animals and left her at the table with the cup and the stove and the sound of the wind coming off the ridge and finding the corners of the house. She sat and drank the coffee and did not let herself think about her cousin yet, because there would be time later and this was not the time. She thought instead about the cup, which was heavy earthenware and had a chip on the rim that had been sanded smooth, so it would not cut a lip. Someone had cared enough to sand it. She turned the cup in her hands and looked at the chip and thought about that. He came back in stamping snow off his boots and shook his coat out on the porch before he brought it inside. He put a pot of beans on the stove that had already been made and only needed warming, and he cut bread from a loaf on the shelf, and he set 2 plates on the table without asking her whether she was hungry. He knew she was. He was not going to make her say so. They ate without much talking. He asked her nothing about where she had come from or where she had been going or who the Halloway woman had been to her. He seemed to understand that she had not yet decided how to say any of it and that pressing would not help. Once, partway through, he said the storm would run 3 days at least by the look of the sky, and she nodded, and he nodded, and that was the whole of the conversation about it. When they were finished, she stood to clear the plates and he let her because he understood that she needed the work more than he needed to spare her from it. She washed the plates in the basin by the stove. He built up the fire in the spare room. When she came to the doorway of it, he was crouched at the small stove with a length of kindling in his hand, and he stood without hurry and stepped past her into the front room, and he said the room would be warm in an hour, and there were extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. He said it the way a man says a thing he has thought about and does not want misunderstood. "Good night, Miss Grace." "Good night, Mr. Reeve." He pulled the door of the front room closed behind him as he went, so the heat of the stove would stay with her, and she stood in the small room and listened to it settle around her. The chest at the foot of the bed was cedar, old, well kept. She opened it and there were blankets folded and a quilt on top of them that had been made by a woman a long time ago. The stitching was even and small and done by lamp light. She ran her hand across it once and closed the chest. She sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the paper from her glove and looked at the name written on it, and then she folded it back the way it had been and put it in the pocket of her dress. Outside, the wind came off the ridge and moved through the pines and did not stop. Morning came slow and gray and did not so much rise as thin. The snow was still coming, though not as heavy as the night before, and the world outside the small window of her room was white on white with the black shapes of pines where the yard ended. She had slept better than she had any right to. She lay for a moment under the quilt and listened to the house. The stove in the front room was going. Somewhere beyond that the dog moved on the porch, its nails on the boards a small, unhurried sound. She got up and dressed and did her hair with the pins she had and went out into the front room. He was at the stove with his back to her and a cup in his hand. He turned when he heard her and nodded once and moved to pour her a cup without asking. She took it from him and sat at the table. He put a pan on the stove and cracked eggs into it and did not talk. She was grateful for the quiet the way a person is grateful for a warm coat. Partway through the eggs, he said the barn would need shoveling out before noon, and the horses would need seeing to, and she said she could help with either or both. He looked at her over the rim of his cup and did not immediately answer. He was measuring again. Then he nodded and said the horses first, if she was willing, because the barn shoveling was a two-man job with the wind coming the way it was, and he did not want her out in it any longer than she needed to be. She put her coat on and her gloves and followed him out. The cold hit her the way cold does when a person has been warm for the first time in a long time and has forgotten what the alternative was like. The dog came with them. The barn was long and low and had a good roof, and inside it smelled of hay and horses, and the particular clean of a barn kept by someone who cared about it. There were 3 horses in stalls and a 4th stall standing empty. He led her to the near stall and showed her where the grain was kept and how much, and how the mare took her water in the morning, and he watched her for a moment to be sure she was steady on her feet, and then he went to the far end of the barn for a shovel. She fed the horses. The mare in the first stall was a bay with a soft eye and a way of pressing her nose to Ellen's shoulder that suggested she had decided about her already. The second was a gelding, older, gray at the muzzle. The third was younger, restless, watching her with the sideways interest of a horse who had opinions. She spoke to them without thinking about it, the way a person speaks to horses when nobody is watching, small quiet nonsense that had nothing in it but the sound of a voice. She did not know Caleb was standing at the far end of the barn with the shovel in his hand, watching without meaning to. He stood a moment, and then he went back to what he had been doing. By the time they came back to the house, the snow had thickened again. He stopped on the porch and knocked the snow off his coat and hers before they went inside. Inside, he put more wood in the stove and did not look at her when he said it, but he said it plainly. "You handled the mare well." She looked at him. It was not a compliment the way most men gave compliments. It was a statement of something noticed. She said thank you and did not make more of it than that, and he nodded once and went to hang his coat, and the small warm thing that had happened between them stayed in the room after he had left it. The middle of the day she made bread. She had asked where the flour was kept and he had shown her without comment, and then he had gone out to work on a harness that needed mending, and she had the kitchen to herself for 2 hours. She made the bread the way her mother had made it, which she had not thought about in years. The kneading was the part she had always liked because it required nothing of her mind. She stood at the table and worked the dough, and the wind came off the ridge outside and the stove kept steady, and she thought about her cousin for the first time since she had crossed the threshold the night before. The letters had been full of ordinary things. Weather and chickens and a neighbor's new baby. Her cousin had written like a woman with time on her hands and a kitchen table to sit at. Ellen had answered from the boarding house with the pen she borrowed from the front desk, and the letters had been the one warm thing in a year of cold rooms. In October there had been no letter, and then in November there had been no letter, and by December she had understood that something was wrong, and by January she had understood that staying in Cheyenne was the thing that was going to break her, and by February she had bought the ticket. She set the dough to rise and covered it with a clean cloth and stood at the window and did not cry, because crying was not what this was for. It was for later. She had learned the difference a long time ago. He came in at mid-afternoon with snow on his shoulders and the harness over his arm, and he stopped inside the door and took a breath and looked at the stove. Bread. It's rising. She did not turn from the window. It'll be another hour. He hung the harness on the peg where the harnesses went, and he stood a moment with his back to her, doing something with his hands that she could not see, and then he turned and crossed to the stove and put a fresh piece of wood into it. "My mother made bread on Wednesdays," he said. He said it to the stove. "The house smelled like this on Wednesdays." She turned then. He was not looking at her. He was watching the fire through the small gap in the door of the stove, and his face had the closed look of a man who had said more than he meant to and was not sure yet whether he regretted it. She did not push into the space he had opened. She only said her own mother had baked on Saturdays, and she had learned it standing on a stool at the table, and she had not made bread for anyone in 6 years. He nodded once, still looking at the fire. He did not ask her why. She did not tell him. It was the shape of a conversation they were not quite having, and both of them understood it, and neither of them stepped further into it than they had. He went out again to the barn. She punched the dough down and set it to rise the second time and washed the flour off her hands in the basin. She stood at the window a while and watched him cross the yard through the falling snow, unhurried, the dog at his heel. He walked like a man who had never been in a hurry in his life and had made his peace with the pace of things a long time ago. She wondered how old he had been when he had made that peace. She wondered whether he had chosen it or whether the land had chosen it for him, and he had only agreed. Supper was the bread and a stew he had put together from what was in the larder, and it was good, and they ate without much talking, and afterward she cleared the plates and he stayed at the table with a book he had taken down from the shelf above the mantel. It was a book of poems. She saw the spine of it when he set it down. She did not comment on it, because commenting on a book a man is reading is a way of asking him to explain himself, and she was not going to ask him to explain anything. When she had finished the dishes, she came back to the table and sat across from him with her mending. She had a torn seam in her second dress that had needed attention for a week, and she had not had the light for it in the boarding house. She threaded her needle by the lamp and started the work, and he did not look up from his book, and the two of them sat at the table with the stove going and the wind at the corners of the house, and it was the quietest she had been in the company of another person in as long as she could remember. He said, after a while and without looking up, that the snow would ease by morning by his read of it, and then it would set in again worse for a day, and then it would break. 3 days from tonight the road would be passable. He said it the way a man reports a fact, not the way a man reports a countdown. She nodded and thanked him for the information and did not look up from her mending. She thought about the road being passable. She thought about the piece of paper in her pocket with her cousin's name on it and the burned-out Holloway place somewhere past the ridge. And she thought about the boarding house in Cheyenne and the pen at the front desk. And she thought about what a woman does when the direction she has been walking in stops being a direction. She kept her hands steady at her mending. She had learned a long time ago that the thinking and the hands were separate things, and one could go on while the other went to pieces, and nobody had to know. He turned a page. He said, still not looking up, that there was work she could do around the place if she wanted, until she decided her next move. Feeding the horses. The bread on Wednesdays if she was willing. He said it the way he said everything plainly, with no weight behind it that she was required to carry. He said it was an offer, not a request, and she could take it or not. She did not answer right away. She finished the seam and cut the thread with her teeth and set the dress aside, and she looked at him across the table, and he was still not looking up from his book, but she knew he was listening. "I'll think on it," she said. He nodded and turned another page, and the fire in the stove settled, and neither of them said anything else for a long while. The second day was worse than he had promised and easier than she had feared. The snow came sideways in the morning, and by noon the yard was a white blur where the barn had been, and he did not let her come out with him to see to the horses because 2 people going out in that weather doubled the chance one would not come back. He said it plainly, without any pride in it, and she did not argue. She watched him from the window with the dog on the porch and the rope he had tied from the porch rail to the barn door, because that was the kind of storm it was. He came back safe and stamped the snow off in the doorway and looked at her once as if to confirm she was still where he had left her, and then he went to the stove and warmed his hands over it without saying anything. She had spent the morning cleaning the front room. Not because it needed it exactly, but because a house that has been kept by one person for a long time collects a particular kind of order that is not the same as clean, and she had wanted to give the place the other thing. She had swept behind the wood box and wiped the lamp chimney and taken down the curtain at the small window over the basin and beaten the winter dust out of it. She had put it back up and it hung better, and the light through it was different, and he had noticed it when he came in and had not said anything about it, but she saw him see it. At midday she asked him about the 4th stall, the empty one. She asked it while she was pouring him coffee and not looking at him because she had learned that certain questions were easier to answer if the asker was not watching. "My brother's horse was in that stall," he said. "He took her east with him when he went." "When was that?" "6 years ago." She set the cup in front of him and took her own to the other side of the table and sat down. "Do you hear from him?" "Now and again. He's got a wife in Chicago and 2 children. He asks me every winter if I'll come out. I ask him every summer if he'll come back. Neither of us does." He said it without bitterness. It was simply the shape of a thing that had settled into being the shape it was. She nodded and did not press. She thought about her own family, which was not a family anymore in any meaningful sense, and she thought about the letters her cousin had sent, which had been the last remaining thread of the thing, and she thought about how a person could be alone in a house and not be lonely, and how she had never quite figured out the difference and suspected he had. In the afternoon Mary came. Not a Mary she knew, a Mary that belonged to the valley. A woman of about 60 who came to the door in a heavy wool coat and a fur hat and stamped her boots on the porch with the confidence of a person who had been coming to that door for a long time. Caleb opened it and stepped back and let her in, and she came into the front room with the cold coming off her and looked at Ellen with an unhurried, unsurprised interest. "Mary Doyle," she said. "I live 2 miles down. I saw the smoke and thought I'd best come see who was making it." She said it lightly. It was not lightly meant. She had come to see who Ellen was, and she had made no pretense about it, and Ellen liked her for that immediately. "Ellen Grace." She stood and offered a hand. "I was walking to my cousin's place at the Halloway when the storm came." Mary Doyle took her hand and held it a moment and looked at her steadily. "Ah," she said. "The Halloway girl. I'm sorry, dear. She was a good woman. It went fast." Ellen nodded. She did not trust her voice for a moment. Mary Doyle did not fill the silence. She turned to Caleb and said she had brought a jar of the pickled beets he liked and a wheel of the cheese from her own goats, and she set them on the table with the economy of a woman who had brought things to that table before. She looked at the bread on the counter and back at Ellen and back at the bread, and something passed across her face that she did not put a name to. "You baked. Yesterday." "Well." Mary Doyle sat down at the table without being asked because she had been sitting at that table for years and did not need asking. "That's the first bread that's been in this house since his mother died. Caleb, dear, put the kettle on." He put the kettle on. Mary Doyle stayed an hour. She drank 2 cups of tea and ate a slice of the bread with butter, and told Ellen the shape of the valley without meaning to be telling her anything, which was the most useful way a person could be told a thing. She talked about the Petersons at the North End who had lost a child to fever the winter before last and had not been the same since. She talked about the schoolhouse that had been built the year she came out in '78 and had a new teacher this year who was making a decent job of it. She talked about the road, which was the county's problem and had been the county's problem for a long time, and which the county was not in a hurry to solve. She talked about Caleb's mother, once, in passing, the way a person talks about someone they have loved and lost and made peace with losing. She said his mother had made bread on Wednesdays, and she looked at Ellen when she said it, not unkindly, and Ellen understood that Mary Doyle had put together more of the story from a loaf of bread on a counter than most people would have put together from a full accounting. She did not ask Ellen what she was going to do. She did not ask her where she would go. She only, when she stood to leave, put her hand on Ellen's arm and said, "You take your time, dear. There's no rush that's worth the making." And she said it in the way of a woman who had earned the right to say such things. And Ellen felt the small, unexpected sting behind her eyes that comes when someone is kind without being asked to be. Caleb walked Mary Doyle to the door and stood with her on the porch a moment, and Ellen did not hear what was said. But when he came back in, he did not look at her right away. And when he did look at her, his face had the same closed, careful quality it had had when he mentioned his mother the day before. He did not tell her what Mary had said. She did not ask. The wind came harder toward evening. He stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and watched the yard for a long time, and then he said, quietly, more to himself than to her, that it was the kind of night when a man was grateful for a good roof. She was at the stove stirring the pot he had put on before Mary came, and she said the roof was a fine one, and he looked at her over his shoulder with something on his face that was not quite a smile but was the country next to it, and he said his father had put the roof on in '81 and it had held. They ate supper. They cleared the plates. She sat down at the table with her mending again because she liked the ritual of it now, and he sat down across from her with the book of poems, and neither of them said anything for a long while. He read for a time and then he closed the book with his finger in it to keep his place, and he set it on the table between them and he looked at her. "You said your mother baked on Saturdays." "She did." "Where's she now?" Ellen kept her hands moving on the mending. It was a question she had been asked before by strangers on trains and in boarding-house dining rooms, and she had learned the short answer for it. "She died when I was 17, my father the year after." She said it evenly. She did not look up. She did not want the softening of a man's face when he heard it, because the softening was always the same and it never helped. He did not soften. He nodded once and looked at the book on the table. "That's a hard thing to carry at 17. It was. Any others, brothers, sisters? A brother, he went to California in '84, I've had one letter since. And the cousin, he was quiet a moment. So you came out here on the strength of a woman you'd never met and a name written on a piece of paper." "I did. That took some doing." She looked up then because his voice had changed, and she wanted to see what was in his face when he said it. He was watching her, plainly, without pity. He had said it the way a man says a fact he has decided is worth acknowledging out loud, and she saw that it was not a judgment of her, and it was not admiration either exactly, but it was the closest thing to being seen that she had felt in a long time, and it did something in her chest she was not prepared for. She looked back down at her mending. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. "It didn't feel like doing anything," she said. "It felt like the only thing left." He nodded slowly and did not answer, and after a while he opened the book again and she went back to her mending, and the stove kept steady, and the wind at the corners of the house did what it had been doing, and the second day of the storm settled itself down toward morning. The third day dawned still. Not quiet exactly, because the wind had left something of itself behind and the pines were still moving with the memory of it, but the snow had stopped. The world outside was white and clean and unmarked. The sun came up pale behind a thin cloud and put a light on the yard that had not been there in 2 days, and Ellen stood at the window with her coffee in her hands and did not move for a long time. He came in from the barn while she was standing there and stopped just inside the door and looked at her looking out. "Road'll be through by tomorrow," he said. "The county sends the plow up from the east side once it clears. Should be here by evening at the latest tomorrow." "That's good," she said. She said it without turning. She did not know what her face was doing and did not want him to see it doing it. She heard him hang his coat and cross to the stove and pour himself a cup, and then she heard him sit at the table, and she stood a moment longer and then she came and sat across from him. He did not press her. He drank his coffee. He looked at the grain of the wood on the table where his cup was sitting. After a while he said the mare had thrown a shoe in the night and he would need to see to it, and she said she would help if he wanted, and he said he did. They worked in the barn most of the morning. He was patient with her because she had never held a horse for a shoeing before, and he showed her how to stand and how to keep her weight against the mare's shoulder and how to talk to her in the low, steady way that kept a horse's attention on the person and off the thing being done to her foot. Ellen learned it because she paid attention. He noticed that she paid attention. He did not say so. When the shoe was on, he stood and pressed his hand to the mare's neck once and said, "Good girl." And Ellen was not sure if he was talking to the mare, and neither was he, and neither of them looked at each other for a moment. At midday they came back to the house, and she made soup from what was in the larder, and he mended a strap at the table, and the two of them worked in the same room without talking, and it was a companionable quiet that she had not expected to know in her life. She thought about the road being through by tomorrow. She thought about the piece of paper in her pocket. She thought about how a person can spend a year knowing exactly what her next step is, and then walk into a stranger's house in a snowstorm and lose the whole shape of the map. He said, without looking up from the strap, that there was a room in town. Mrs. Corcoran ran a boarding house above the Mercantile. It was clean and the food was decent and the woman was fair. He said it the way a man lays out an option, not the way a man makes a suggestion. He did not look at her when he said it. He was giving her something to hold that was not the paper in her pocket, and she understood the gift of it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, still working on the strap. In the afternoon she asked him if she could go out to the barn alone. She wanted to feed the mare a piece of the apple she had put by from lunch, and she wanted the walk across the yard, and she wanted the 10 minutes of standing in a barn without a man in it. He said yes, and did not ask why, and did not watch her go from the window, which she saw when she looked back from the porch. He was a man who understood the shape of a person needing to be alone for 10 minutes, and he was not going to make anything of it. The barn was warm with the horses in it. The mare took the apple from her palm with the delicacy of a horse who has been given apples before by hands she trusts. Ellen stood with her hand on the mare's neck and looked at the empty fourth stall for a long time. She thought about the brother in Chicago and the horse he had taken with him and the 6 years of a stall standing empty. She thought about her own brother in California and the one letter and the 6 years, and the way an empty place in a house or a family can either be a wound or a room, depending on how a person decides to hold it. She stood in the barn a while longer and then she went back to the house. He was at the stove. He did not turn when she came in. He said, without looking, that supper was nearly ready, and she said she would set the table, and she did, and they sat down and ate. And the third day of the storm ended the way the 2 days before it had ended, in a warm room with a stove going and the wind gone quiet outside, and the difference was that tomorrow the road would be clear. She did not sleep well. She lay under the quilt in the small room with the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and she listened to the house the way she had listened to it the first night. And it was the same house, and it was not the same house, and she did not know when the shift had happened, and it did not matter when it had happened because it had. She got up before the light and dressed in the dark and went out into the front room. He was already at the stove. He had known she was awake because he was a man who knew the sound of a house he lived in, and he had put the coffee on without waiting for her. He handed her a cup without a word, and she took it and stood by the stove because standing by a stove in the last dark before dawn was a thing that did not require anything of a person. They did not talk. There was a great deal that could have been said, and neither of them was going to be the one to start. When the sky had grayed enough to see by, he put on his coat and said he was going out to look at the road. She said she would come with him. He looked at her a moment and then he nodded, and she put on her coat and her gloves and they went out together with the dog behind them, and the yard was crisp under their boots, and the pines dropped small dry falls of snow as they passed, and the air was so cold it took the edge off her thinking, which she was grateful for. They walked the length of the wagon track down to the fork where the county road came through. The county road was still under a foot of snow, but there were runner tracks on it. Somebody had come through in a sledge in the last hour. He stood in the middle of the road and looked east and then west, and he said the plow would be through by noon at the latest by the look of those tracks, and she said yes, and neither of them moved for a moment. He looked at her. Ellen. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked at him. He did not speak right away. He was a man who had made his peace with silence a long time ago, and he was not going to let the moment push him into saying more than he meant. He looked at the road and then at her, and he said what he had come out to the road to say, and he said it the way he said everything plainly with no dressing on it. "You don't have to go to town." She waited. She did not fill the space. "There's work here." He was looking at the road, not at her. "The bread on Wednesdays, like I said, the horses, the mending. A house is easier with two, and I'd been managing, but I'd not call it easy." He paused. He was picking his words the way a man picks his footing on ice. "It's a fair offer, room and board, a wage if you want one. I'd not ask anything of you that you didn't offer first. You'd have your own room and your own door, and you'd be free to go whenever you decided going was the thing." He stopped. He had said what he had come to say. He was not going to embellish it, and he was not going to press. She looked at the road. She thought about it honestly, because she owed him that. She thought about the boarding house in town and the room above the mercantile and the small work she might find and the winters ahead of her alone in a rented room. She thought about the piece of paper in her pocket and the burned Holloway place somewhere past the ridge, which she would never see now, and the cousin who had written her about chickens and weather and a neighbor's new baby and had been the last warm thing. She thought about the barn and the mare and the empty stall, and the sanded chip on the cup, and the quilt in the cedar chest that had been made by a woman a long time ago by lamplight. She thought about a man who had crossed a yard through the falling snow the day she arrived and had not asked her a question she could not yet answer. She thought about the shape of a life. She had been walking toward a shape of a life for a year, and the shape had turned out to be a burned place, and now there was another shape in front of her, and it was not the shape she had been walking toward, but it was a shape, and the ground under it held. "Yes," she said, "I'd like to stay." He nodded once. He did not look at her. He was looking at the road, and something in his shoulders eased, and she saw the easing and did not comment on it. He turned and started walking back toward the house, and she walked beside him, and the dog fell in on her side, which the dog had not done before. They came back to the yard as the sun broke through and put a first proper light on the roof of the house, and the smoke was going up from the chimney straight and steady, and the barn stood square where it had stood for 11 years, and for the first time since Cheyenne, she was walking toward a house instead of past one. The plow came through at midday. She heard it from the kitchen, the low grinding of it on the county road, and she stood at the window and watched the small dark shape of it move east to west across the far end of the wagon track, and then it was past and gone, and the road behind it was black in the snow. The world had opened up again. She stood at the window and looked at it and felt no pull in any direction, which was a thing she had not felt in a year. In the afternoon, Mary Doyle came back. She came on a small sledge with a boy of about 14 driving it, who she introduced as her nephew Thomas, and she brought a basket with a ham in it and a jar of preserves, and she came into the front room the way she had come in before, without knocking, because the house had been on her route for a long time. She looked at Ellen and then at Caleb and then at the two coats on the pegs by the door, the third one being Ellen's now, and she did not say anything about the third coat, which was how Ellen understood that she had seen it. "Well," Mary said, "the road's through." "It is," Ellen said. Mary Doyle looked at her, and she looked at Caleb, and she nodded once with the small definite nod of a woman who had drawn a conclusion and was satisfied with the drawing. "Good," she said. She set the ham on the table. "You'll want that for Sunday." She did not stay long. She had come only to see what needed seeing, and she had seen it, and she went out to the sledge with her nephew, and Caleb walked her to it and helped her up, and Ellen watched from the porch, and Mary Doyle looked back at her once and lifted her hand, and Ellen lifted hers back, and then the sledge went out the wagon track and turned onto the county road and was gone. Caleb came back to the porch. He stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up at her. "She likes you," he said. "I liked her. She'll tell the valley by tomorrow's supper." "Tell them what?" He looked at her a moment. His face did the thing it had done at the road that morning, the small easing that was not a smile but the country next to it. "That you're stopping," he said. "That's the news. The rest of it she'll leave alone. She's good that way." Ellen nodded. She thought about a valley full of people who would know by tomorrow's supper that she was stopping, and she thought about how in Cheyenne there had not been a person who would have known if she had gone or stayed for a month, and she thought about which of those two things a person actually wanted, and she was surprised by how quickly the answer came. That evening, they did not sit with the mending and the book of poems. He asked her, at the table after supper, if she would want to come into town with him the next day. He had a delivery of a cabinet he had finished the week before to make to the schoolmaster's wife, and he thought she might want to see the town for herself, and meet Mrs. Corcoran at the boarding house, because Mrs. Corcoran was the sort of person it was useful to know regardless, and there was a general store where she might want to look at what they had. He said it plainly in the way of a man laying out a day. He did not say the other thing, which was that he wanted the town to see her walking beside him. She heard the other thing anyway. She was glad he had not said it out loud, because saying it out loud would have made her decide something she was not ready to decide yet, and not saying it out loud let her go without deciding. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." He nodded. She sat at the table a little while after he had taken his book down and settled into the chair by the stove, and she took the folded paper out of her pocket and looked at the name on it one last time. Her cousin's handwriting, the small, careful loop of the H in Halloway. She had carried the paper for 2 months. She had walked into the valley on the strength of it, and it had held her up through a great deal. She stood and crossed to the stove and opened the small door and put the paper on the coals and closed the door again. She did it without ceremony because ceremony was not what it was for. Caleb looked up from his book once and looked at her and looked back at the book, and he did not say anything, and she was grateful for that too. She sat back down at the table with her mending. She thought about her cousin, who she had never met and would never meet now, and she thought that a woman she had never met had brought her, by a long, strange road, to a place with a good roof and a stove that held steady and a man who read poems in the evening and did not ask questions before their time. She thought that this was a strange accounting, and she did not fully understand it, and she thought she did not need to fully understand it in order for it to be true. The stove settled. The wind outside was a small, ordinary wind now, not the storm wind. The dog was asleep on the boards by the door. Caleb turned a page. She threaded a fresh needle and went back to work. The town in the morning was small and busy and cold. He drove the wagon in with the cabinet lashed in the bed and a wool blanket over her lap, and she sat beside him on the box and watched the country pass, and did not talk much because he did not talk much, and the quiet was the quiet they had settled into. The valley was wide and white, and the pines went on at the edges of it, and the smoke of the ranches showed here and there in thin, steady lines against the pale sky. He named the places as they passed them. The Petersons at the north end, the Doyle place 2 miles down, the schoolhouse at the crossroads with the small bell on the roof and a boy shoveling the step. The town was one long street with a mercantile at one end and a livery at the other, and a church on a small rise behind it. He pulled the wagon up at the schoolmaster's house and carried the cabinet in with the schoolmaster's help, and Ellen sat on the box a moment and looked at the street. A woman across the way at the dry goods was watching her without pretending not to. A man in front of the livery lifted his hat to her as he passed. She lifted her hand back. Word had traveled, the way Caleb had said it would. She had thought she would mind it, and she found that she did not. Mrs. Corcoran at the boarding house was a wide, sturdy woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and a way of looking at a person that assessed and approved in the same movement. She took Ellen's hand and held it a moment and said Mary Doyle had spoken of her, and she said it in the way of a woman letting Ellen know that she had been vouched for by a person whose vouching mattered. She gave her a cup of coffee and asked her nothing personal, and told her about the town in 10 minutes with the efficiency of a woman who had told newcomers about the town many times before. When Ellen stood to go, Mrs. Corcoran walked her to the door and said, plainly, that if she ever needed a room the door was open, and Ellen understood the door was open in more ways than one, and was grateful for both. She met Caleb at the mercantile. He was at the counter with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and he did not tell her what was in it. He carried it out to the wagon and set it under the seat, and he handed her up onto the box and climbed up beside her, and they went back down the long street with the town watching them go. Halfway home, the sun came full through and put a hard, clean light on the snow, and he stopped the wagon at the top of the rise where the road began the long, slow drop into the valley. He did not stop for any reason. He just stopped. He sat on the box with the reins loose in his hands and looked out at the valley, and she sat beside him and looked too, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "That's the place," he said finally, and pointed with his chin. The low roof at the bend of the creek. She saw it. The house was small at that distance, and the barn was square beside it, and the smoke was going up steady from the chimney. The horse in the near pen was a small dark shape against the snow. She looked at it a long time. "It's a good place," she said. "It is." He chirped to the horses and they went on. He did not look at her when he said the next thing. He said it toward the road ahead. "I got you a shawl at the store. It's in the parcel." He paused. I saw you were cold coming into town. Yours is thin." She looked at him. He was watching the road. He had said it the way a man says a thing he has thought about and does not want made more of than it is. She looked at the parcel under the seat and back at his face in profile against the winter light. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and did not answer, and the horses went on down the road into the valley, and the smoke at the bend of the creek grew closer, and the sun kept up on the snow, and she sat on the box beside him with her hands in her lap and let the shape of it settle. They came into the yard in the early afternoon. He unhitched the horses and she carried the parcel in and set it on the table, and she opened it standing at the table with her coat still on. The shawl was gray wool, heavy, well made, with a small dark blue border worked into the edge of it. It was a plain shawl and a good one. She stood at the table and ran her hand across it and did not cry, because crying was not what it was for. But she stood there a long moment before she folded it back into the paper and set it on the chair by the door. He came in from the barn and hung his coat and looked at the shawl on the chair and looked at her and did not say anything, and she did not say anything, and she went to the stove and put the kettle on, and the afternoon settled around them the way afternoons in that house had begun to settle. Outside the wind was small and ordinary. The horse in the pen shifted. The dog on the porch stretched and lay down again with a long, slow breath. On the shelf above the window, a small enamel tin that had held nothing for 6 years now held a folded square of blue cloth from the trimming of the shawl, because Ellen had cut it clean and saved it without knowing why, except that it seemed like the kind of thing a woman ought to save at the start of a life. And that was the story of Ellen Grace, who set out to walk to a place that was no longer there, and arrived instead at one that had been waiting a long time to be found.